Welcome to this installment of the Chinese Business History webinar here at the Hong Kong Institute for the Humanities and Social Sciences. This is the first webinar of the fall semester. So welcome. I'm joined today here also by my colleague, Dr. John Wong, who is also part of the Chinese Business History subgroup at the Institute. Now, today we're very happy and lucky to welcome to the webinar Dr. Juanjuan Peng, who is Associate Professor of History at Georgia Southern University. She was educated at One University and the Johns Hopkins University, and she works on the social and economic history of modern China, and part of it, of course, also Chinese business history. Her first book, the Yudahua Business Group in China's Early Industrialization, was published by Rowman and Littlefield in 2020, and that is also what she will be talking to us, what she will be talking about today. Before I hand things over to Dr. Peng, I should say a few words about the format. So we are using the webinar format. That means that Dr. Peng will speak for roughly half an hour, and then we'll have roughly half an hour for Q&A. If you have any questions for Dr. Peng, please, either during her talk or during the Q&A period, just post them through the Q&A button in Zoom, and I will then read them out during the Q&A period, and Dr. Peng can then get back to you. But without taking up any further time, Juanjuan, if you want to start, please feel free to do so.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, everybody, for inviting me over. It's my honor to share my research with you in this group. And first, let me share my screen, so we'll go directly to the topic. Today, I'm going to talk about the Yudahua Business Group in China's early industrialization. This is also the talk is based on my book that was published in 2020. And first, I want to explain a little bit about what is Yudahua, and also offer a brief overview of the company's history from late 19th century to the middle of the 20th century. And Yudahua, the name of the company, actually it's a combination of the three individual companies that were registered independently, separately, but they were owned by the same group of shareholders, and they were managed by the same team of top managers. Okay, Yudahua, Yu stands for Yuhua, Da stands for Daxing, and Hua stands for Dahua. So it's actually a combination of three companies. The story of this business enterprise can be traced back to the 1890s. One of the self-strengthening enterprise, Hubei Textile Bureau, Hubei Shabu Sima Siju, which was founded by Zhang Zhidong, went bankrupt during this period due to financial difficulties. And so after bankruptcy, the state-owned enterprise was rented to private merchants, and Chuxing was one of the company that held the lease of Hubei Textile Bureau during the first decade of the 20th century and first 2 decades of the 20th century. And during the Great War, because the foreign business withdrew from the market, that created an unprecedented opportunity for China's early industrialists. And therefore, Chuxing was able to make handsome profits based on their operation of the leased Hubei Textile Bureau. When the lease was ended, and the managers of Chuxing, who formerly were a group of long-distance traders, and they decided they're going to found their own textile factories. And in the early 1920s, two sister companies, Yudahua in metropolitan Wuhan and the Daxing in semi-rural Shijiazhuang, was thus established. And during this stage, in the 1920s, the two companies, Yudahua and the Daxing, were managed quite differently and separately. And this was partially due to the distance between the two locations. At that time, after the Jinghan Railway was finished, it still takes almost 2 days for somebody to travel from Wuhan to Shijiazhuang. And another important reason that led to very separate and different management strategy, management arrangement in the two companies was due to their very different local social and economic context. A comparison between Yudahua and Daxing indicates that the so-called Chinese way of doing business can vary greatly from one place to another. The situation started to change in the 1930s. And at the beginning of the 1930s, due to an industry-wide crisis faced by almost all the Chinese-owned textile companies in China, Daxing and Yudahua was forced to cooperate with each other in order to lower the cost, in order to explore new markets. It was at that moment they start to build a joint, shared sales and purchasing networks. And they also jointly invested on a third mill, which is Dahua in Xi'an, to explore new markets in the Northwest. During the war, from the late 1930s to the early 1940s, this business continued to expand. First, at the beginning of the war, the Wuhan mill moved with the nationalist government to Chongqing. And then in the middle of the war, the Xi'an mill, in order to protect its machinery from the Japanese air bombing, moved part of its machine to the mountainous Guangyuan in Sichuan province and built a much smaller mill in Guangyuan. And then toward the end of the war, due to very strict price control policy in the wartime capital, the Chongqing mill built a new, a smaller mill in Chengdu in order to escape the wartime price control. What they did is they secretly ship the products made in the Chongqing mill to Chengdu, and then through the Chengdu mill, they sold the products at a higher price to the market. Therefore, by the late 1940s, at the end of the war, the business Yudahua business group already involved into a relatively integrated business group with the 6 member mills and with 1 national bank, and that had multiple branches and 1 coal mine, and also a trading company that deals with both import and export business. At the end of 1951, after the liberation, Yudahua and Dahua were turned into public and private joint venture. And the capitalists, the owner-managers of Yudahua willingly given up part of their control to the local government. They sold their shares to the local Wuhan government, because partially due to the changing political environment after the liberation, and also partially due to the financial crisis, the low working capital situation they were facing, and that was caused by wartime overexpansion. And the nationalization of Daxing, the third mill, on the other hand, took place roughly 2 years later. And the time lag implied the partial disintegration of this business group, which was eventually dismantled in 1957. And my story of Yudahua and therefore ended in the middle of the 1950s. Here, I first want to talk about the uniqueness of the Yudahua case. Why, in this case, it's important. Why does it matter? First, it's a large-scale, understudied modern enterprise in early 20th century China. It was arguably the third largest Chinese-owned textile manufacturer, and that was outranked only by Shenzhen and Yong'an. We know there's a lot of research about Shenzhen. There's plenty of research about Yong'an, but few research has been done on Yudahua. Therefore, my book is actually the first research book that has been written on Yudahua, on this company. And before my book, back in the 1980s, there was a compiled source book about the company that was published in the middle of the 1980s. And inspired by the source book, there was a handful of research articles that were published in late 1980s and early 1990s. And that's about it. To my knowledge, there was also a PhD dissertation written by a student from Huazhong Shifan University, but she never turned the dissertation into a book. And there's very limited research has been done on this company, which made it an important job to do. And the Yudahua case, it's unique also because this is a typical family firm that adopted some special, if not unique, institutional arrangement, which made it different from many companies, many modern companies in early 20th century China that we are familiar with. Unlike many other family firms during that time period, and this company was not owned or controlled by a single family. They were three leading families, okay? And then there were 5 key owner managers, and the company was controlled by within the 5 key managers. And the families, the leading families, the key owner managers, they were tied together not by kinship, but by friendship. Okay, it was a friendship they developed over time through their long-term cooperation, long-term partnership as business partners. This type of team management allow the company to have an easy adoption of corporate hierarchy, and also allow the business group to have a high level of groupness, which meant there's a very close connection between the member mills, and there's a very close interfirm relations. And that was quite different from many other large business conglomerate we are familiar with. In another word, this company appeared to be more modern or more progressive compared to many other cases we are familiar with. Again, and just give you a couple of examples. First, the company had frequent directors meeting, and it had regular shareholders meeting, and in those meetings they actually have real discussion on important business issues, and they make real decision, real and important decision on those meetings, which is not very common among the companies we have already studied before. And also another example is there's leadership succession. Okay, when the old top manager, when the old chief executive in one case retired and in another case died, he did not pass the central leadership control over his own son or other kind of relatives. Instead, he selected an able colleague, able co-worker to be the next leader of the business empire. And once again, that's very rare. That's a typical for a modern Chinese firm. And the case is also important because this is an inland company. We know there are plenty of inland inland business during the early 20th century China, but there's not sufficient study on them. Our research predominantly done on the business that's along the coast, like enterprises in Shanghai or sometime in Tianjin. And we need to know more about the inland companies, and the inland companies actually offered a different path of success. And Yudahua, for example, it did not have easy access to cutting edge technology. It didn't have easy access to modern management technique, and not even financial markets. The company rarely borrowed money from the banks, and it relied exclusively on returned earnings for further investment. Despite the technological inferiority, the company managed to succeed, achieve enormous success, because it avoided competition, and by focusing on low-end products, low-end market, and located its factories in industrial backward regions where there was less competition and where there was plenty of rural weavers who created a large demand for the company's products. And this special path of success also meant the company become an industrial pioneer in its host cities, and brought industrialization and modernization to those places. So this actually, the story of Yudahua actually is a story of social impact of China's early industrialization, and especially in places like Shijiazhuang, Xi'an, and Guangyuan. When the company built its factory there, it was the first large-scale industrial factory in those cities and the towns, and therefore it had a profound social and economic impact on those localities. Although Yudahua case was unique in many ways, it still shared the same experience. There still shared experience between Yudahua and many other Chinese modern enterprises during the same period. One shared theme in the study of Chinese business history is changes and continuities, especially continuities, which was emphasized by Chinese business historians during the last decade. And in this story, I emphasized on two crucial moments. One is the 1890s, when the bankrupt self-strengthening enterprise was leased out to private merchants, and therefore laid the foundation for later development of Yudahua and the later development of China's early industrialization. Another crucial moment I look at is the 1949 divide. Again, this is a time period, this is an issue that has been revisited by Chinese business historians during the past decade or so. By comparing Yudahua's the situation in the 1940s and the 1950s, I argue that wartime legacy was one key factor that shaped Yudahua's post-1949 development. Its welfare facility, for example, the business start to engage in welfare enterprise during the wartime, partially due to the wartime labor shortage and partially due to the wartime hyperinflation. And this kind of wartime welfare facility development was continued into the 1950s and further promoted by the new communist government. Another shared theme is entrepreneurship, and like many other studies of Chinese business history, I see entrepreneurship and Yudahua entrepreneurs and their business decision as the main driving force behind the growth of this business. So one of the key focus of this book is how those owner-managers, those entrepreneurs, made their important business decisions, and what kind of internal factors and external factors had shaped those decisions. Then I want to talk briefly about what kind of archives I used for this study. The four main sources of my archive material come from the following. And the first is the company files of Yudahua from the Wuhan Municipal Archive. As I mentioned earlier, there was a compiled source book published in the 1980s, and this was a government-sponsored project, so it received the wide support from all the 6 mills in order to write the compiled source book. And the people who work in this project gathered all the pre-1949 company records from individual mills in different locations, and they gather everything in Wuhan. They work on the projects for a couple of years, and when after the book was finished, after the book was published, they technically dump everything to the Wuhan Municipal Archives and leave it there. And the local archive didn't do a good job to maintain and to organize those archives. It was very unfortunate. And the shape of that large collection of Yudahua archive was pretty bad. And most of the documents were undated and not in good order. And the folder, if you open up one folder, the title of the folder oftentimes does not indicate what's inside the folder. I would say the condition of this company archive collection was probably the reason that this important large-scale early 20th century and Chinese enterprise was understudied, and because it was so hard to navigate through the archive. And to facing this kind of challenge from the archive, I also search for other kind of archive materials in individual factories. I went to Wuhan Yuhua Company, I went to Xi'an Dahua Company, and luckily I found a small collection of interviews and memoirs in Wuhan Yuhua Company archives. And those are the records that were created during the 1980s when the company employee tried to write their own factory history book. And in Xi'an Dahua Company, I managed to gain the access of the original company records during the 1950s. And this kind of records from the state-owned enterprise, it's normally not accessible to the researchers, especially to foreign researchers. But luckily, the business went bankrupt in 2008. And therefore, because the business already gone, and the things they kept in the company archives were no longer considered top secret, and the disclosure was considered less threatening. So I made friends with the girls who maintained surviving archives, and I managed to get access to it. And those archive collections are further supplemented by my interviews conducted over the past decades or so. I interviewed a manager, a worker, and I also interviewed the people who work for the compiled source book, and he himself interviewed the top managers when they were still alive. And I also had managed to contact the daughter of one key founder, and also the grandson of another key founder. Okay, so those interviews are an important source of my study as well. At last, I want to talk about what happened to the mills after the 1950s. Like I mentioned earlier, my book ends in the middle of the 1950s. And after that, all the mills become nationalized, they turned into state-owned enterprises, and they survived the Cultural Revolution. After the economics reform started, all of them went through a new golden age. During the late 1970s and the early 1980s. Starting from the middle of the 1980s, due to the slow growth of demand and rapid increase of supply, and the company, all the 6 mills start to face new financial difficulties. And eventually during the 1990s, when Chinese government started state-owned enterprise reform, the mills of Yudahua gradually filed for bankruptcy. Okay, the first one who became bankrupt was the Guangyuan mill. It filed for bankruptcy in 1999, and then during the first decades of the 21st century, all the mills become bankrupt with only one exception. Okay, the Yudahua Wuhan mill is the only one that is still in operation. And in 1994, as part of the reform of state-owned enterprise, and this business was reorganized into a limited corporation, and with the state controlling the majority of the share, so it still can be considered a state-owned enterprise now. And that concludes my presentation, and I'm looking forward to your comments and the questions. Do you want me to stop sharing?
Yeah, I think that's okay. You can stop sharing. Yeah, but Juanjuan, thank you so much for this wonderful presentation, and yeah, what a wonderful case study, I think. So as I said, if there are any questions, please post them in the Q&A, through the Q&A button in Zoom, and I'll read them out then. So maybe to start us off, what I wanted to ask about is, I mean, it's obviously a fascinating study, particularly because it covers such a long period of time. And I guess what I was reminded of was certainly Brett Sheehan's work on business in North China that also looks at a rather long time period. So, and he of course makes the point of kind of looking how Chinese business reacted to different Chinese regimes, ranging from the late Qing up to the early PRC. So I wonder whether you could talk a bit about that, like how can you say anything about the kind of differences in terms of how Yudahua managed to deal with political upheavals, but also the changing regimes that it kind of lived through?
And I feel this business, I didn't focus too much on the state and business relations in my book, partially because the limited archive materials I have access to. Originally, I want to focus on the interaction between the business and the local government in Shijiazhuang, where there was a big business and a very small government, and the business had a very large influence in the local community, and also the business was foreign, was from the owners and the managers coming from outside the local area. So I originally want to write a story, more a social history story and centered around one business, and unfortunately I couldn't find enough local survived the local materials, simply because Shijiazhuang was too small a place back then, and they didn't have. Also, it was occupied by the Japanese later, so whatever got left had been destroyed during the war, and I couldn't find enough material to write a story like that. But for the rest of the company history, I also did not emphasize. I talk about the state business relations, but I did not emphasize on that because I feel the group of owner managers I focus on, they don't care too much about politics. And the political changes, the different regime, the interaction with the different regime, to them is only one of the changing factor that they encountered in their business encountered every day. And what they did is they trying to make the best out of whatever they got, and nobody had any kind of political ambition, and few of them had strong political connection, with only one exception. There was one manager. He was not a founder. He was not a main shareholder either. He was a manager. He was a hired manager, but he was very important in this group because he was the one who had political connection. And his brother was a high-ranking officer in the government from the warlord period, and then to the nationalist government as well. And later on, during the 1940s, his daughter married Jiang Qieshi's second son, Jiang Weiguo. Okay, and she was Jiang Weiguo's first wife. She died early, so she's rather not that famous. And this marriage made the manager, this hired manager, a kind of a in-law of Jiang Jieshi, gave him very special political influence. And due to this marriage, the Yudahua owner managers, those top managers, promoted this hired manager to the top rank, and he kind of joined other owner managers to be one of the top manager. And he was the only exception, but even him didn't care too much about politics and didn't have the ambition to have any kind of political career. He was more like he see himself mostly an engineer, and he wants to manage his factory. He cares about the technical part of the business operation, and he even wrote a textbook about cotton textile engineering that was used in the factory as a textbook for the employees training. Okay, so these are a group of people. Again, this is a group of entrepreneurs who who cares about profits, who cares about their business, who occasionally appear to be patriotic and cares about the fate of the entire country, but they don't have ambition, any kind of political ambition. Even in places where the business has a very strong social impact, economic impact, that has a very strong voice in the local society. They did not get too much involved in the local politics either. I'm not saying politics was not a major factor in the business operation. I'm saying their attitude, they see this as one of the factors that shape their decisions.
Sure, thank you. We have first question from Peter Hamilton, and he asks, I wonder if you could speak more about the group's evolving management practices. You mentioned they were quite different, I think. Did any of them adopt foreign models, such as scientific management?
No, not at all. They're very traditional, they're very conservative. Like I mentioned earlier, they didn't even borrow money from the banks. They thought that was too risky. Originally, their money, their initial capital came from the money they made when they leased the self-strengthening enterprise, and then they keep using the retained earnings for further investment. So those are a group of traditional indigenous Chinese businessmen who's conservative, who just do things step by step. They don't want anything, any fancy theory, fancy ideas, and they just testing the water to see where they can have the opportunity, where they can make monies, and do step by step. That's their style. But at the same time, one of the key managers in this group, the second chief executive, he was a learned man himself. He was originally not a trader. He was originally a journalist. And he wrote something that considered he wrote something to criticize the Qing government. So to avoid any kind of political consequence, he escaped and found a job in the trading company, and that turned him into a trader. And he cares about education, even though he himself did not have formal education. He sent his children to get foreign education. Okay, like his oldest son got a degree from a U.S. university, and he also graduated from Nankai University, the Economic Institute of Nankai, which is very famous even now. And then he had another child sent to Japan. Another son sent to Japan for higher education. Another one sent to North Carolina for bachelor degree as well. And obviously, he wants to push to that direction. He wants to adopt the foreign, the more modern, more advanced management skill, but not by himself, by his children who actually receive the Western education, the foreign education, and who may gradually lead the business into that direction. But unfortunately, he died too early, and then the communists take over everything, change the fate of the business.
All right, thank you. The next question comes from Tian Chong, and the question is, what was the reaction in the family, business, or in the community to the decision not to pass down the business to his son, which is contrary to the traditional Chinese family structure? I'm
not sure how the first and there are two leadership transition in the history of this business. And the first one took place too early. The first top leader, he founded business when he was already in his 50s. So he didn't stay in the position for already in his 60s, actually. He started Chuxing when he was in late 40s. And then when Yuhua and Daxing was founded, he was already close to 60s. He didn't stay in position for too long. And the records suggest that his own sons were not able managers. So he only left them his shell, but they held no managerial position in the business. And I don't know how they felt about it, but I knew what the son of the second leader felt about it. The second chief executive was the learned man I just mentioned, and his children were the ones who received the good education. His oldest son was the one graduated from Nankai Economic Institute, and he would be fine about this decision, partially because he himself would consider him as an inexperienced manager who's not eligible to take over the business, and partially because the third business leader was his father-in-law. Okay, and he was his father-in-law. So original intention was to pass the business to his father-in-law, and maybe eventually, after a couple of years, eventually the leadership can be further passed to him. And he was the son of the second leader, but still, and if that happens as what the second chief executive planned, he would grow up to be an able manager, a qualifying successor.
All right, thank you.
If I can jump in here quickly with a question. Your story is lovely because it redirects our attention to a different part of China for this very exciting period of development. Is there something that you've noticed in its location, especially how the story unfolded in the context of infrastructure development? And I mean that both in terms of the hard infrastructure of transportation, that you have to ship the raw materials to this location and also out of this, and the products out of this location, and also the social networks of people. Where they were educated, where they were trained, where the connections were, especially with shifting geopolitical centers during the various regimes.
Okay, could you clarify your second question? I wasn't sure where it's pointing to. Okay,
well, the first part is about the hard infrastructure of, say, transportation. The second part is more the social networks of people. How they were connected with powerful people, either in politics or in commerce, for access to capital, for access to political decisions that would be favorable for business development.
Okay, yeah, I got it. And the first question, the transportation, the business chose those underdeveloped, so-called economic backward area, but at the same time, they also choose the one that's with good transportation and with newly built railway. For example, Shijiazhuang, they chose Shijiazhuang because Jinghan Railway was just finished, and there was another Zhentai Railway. Zhentai and Jinghan kind of the juncture of Zhentai and Jinghan was near Shijiazhuang. Okay, and that was one reason they chose the location. And Xi'an for the same thing. Xi'an, they chose Xi'an because the new railway just moved there and connect Xi'an to the northern China, northern part of China. And but for the Guangyuan case, they chose the Guangyuan location was more a failure. They chose it because they heard there was a plan that a railway will build there, or a highway. I can't remember, either a road or railway will be constructed there, but it did not happen. And so that location was least cost effective. And that's also why that factory was the first one who filed bankruptcy decades later, because the location was not ideal for textile manufacturing. It was in mountainous area without good transportation network. So I guess I answered your transportation part of the question, and then the business network. That was challenging because every time because at that time in China, if you come from another province, it's like you come from another country now, and they're foreigners, they're outsiders, and in order to open up a big business like a textile manufacturer, factories, cotton mills, they need to create and maintain a good relationship with the local forces. Okay, the people, the local leaders, either economic leader or political leader. And sometimes I know in the Shijiazhuang case, their original strategy is they did use middlemen. They use middlemen for the purchasing and the marketing aspect, because the local middleman, they had connection. They used the middleman at the beginning, and when they started open up their business and made their own business connection, they gradually get rid of the middleman and then build their direct control, the sales and marketing networks about 1 or 2 decades later. I think that was one strategy they used.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great, thanks. The next question we have comes from Oyentin. The question is, would you please say more about how the Yudahua's managers managed the textile of different locations as one business? Thank you.
Okay. They did not manage it as one single business, but they coordinate between the member firms, member mills. And for example, they trying to build a shared sales and marketing network, and they have shared purchasing house, and that was funded by different member mills, and they collect the money expense from each member mills, and then that shared marketing or sales office would purchase cotton for each different member mill. They would send a letter to the managers of each factory and say, there's this type of cotton at this type of price, and we can get how many amount, and how big an order you want. And then they, through that kind of communication, they purchase for each individual mill. That was one way they cooperated. And also toward the end of the 1940s, they made efforts to introduce standardized accounting system, which I don't think they actually finished the process. They started with one mill and then want to introduce to the other mills, but got interrupted by the war, and then the communists take over came, and situation start to change. But that was one direction, and they were trying to go to. And also they hired workers together, not workers, employees, not the workers on the shop floor, but the staff who work in the accounting department or other kind of engineers, and the headquarters would hire together and train those employees and then offered to each individual meal, and that was another way they cooperate with each other. I wouldn't say it was managed as a single company, but there's close coordination, close connection between the business, and it was the entire business group was under the control of a single person.
All right, thank you. Are there any other questions? I mean, one question I wanted to ask is, you say, of course, that you kind of end your story in 1957, once all the different companies are sort of turned into state enterprises. But I was wondering whether you could first of all talk a bit more about how this process of turning them into state enterprises worked, and whether they might not still actually have been some kind of continuities in terms of who the managers were. Because I think we know that, of course, yeah, in the 1950s, it was sort of the end of private enterprise in many ways, but of course, many of the managers and so on stayed on, of course. So I was wondering whether you could talk a bit about that.
Okay, and the managers with either financial skill or the engineering skill got to stay. The staff that only have managerial skill usually was not treated well. You need to have some specialized skill to be remained in the position through the later years after the nationalization, after it turned into state-owned enterprise. Some of them got to stay, and they are and they continue to play a very important role in the business. And you're on the first part of your question. Could you remind me? I got
just in
lost.
general, whether you could talk about the process of turning.
Oh, the nationalization process.
Yeah, exactly.
And what happened is the business was always very conservative, like one step after the other. But during the war, they were kind of forced to expand. In order to survive, they were forced to expand. This over-expansion was the problem that led to financial failures, and that led to the nationalization of the business. Before the government required all the private business to become joint ventures. And what happened back then was one of their business, I think it's the coal mine, got itself into trouble, and then in order to I think the coal mine went bankrupt, and then coal mine owned some of the shares of the cotton mill. And in order to pay off the debt of the coal mine, they sold the share to the local government. And that was how it turned into a joint venture. And in another word, their key business was doing fine, but they overexpanded some of the new investment, got them into trouble. Okay, even the cotton mill, it's the same. It was the Guangyuan mill and the Chengdu mill, because they were too small and they were built during the wartime, and they were the one that incurred loss. And the old ones, the Wuhan one, the Shijiazhuang one, the Chongqing one, continue to make profits. But the business got too big, and those new member firms, when they got into financial problems, it dragged everybody down, and so in order to survive, and the capitalists gave up.
All right, thank you. Yeah, that's very interesting.
Yeah.
unless we have any final questions, I think we can conclude this session, because I think we're also coming up on our time in any case. So what remains for me is to Dr. Peng, thank you very much for taking the time to talk about to talk to us about your wonderful research. As I think we've all said, a wonderful case study, a fascinating case. Before we conclude things, I should briefly mention that the Chinese Business History webinar will return on the 7th of October. And then we will have George Chow of MS College talk about his wonderful research on merchants and merchant societies in central Shanxi in the 18th and 19th century. And as always, we will advertise that through email and on social media. So I hope to see many of you there. But once again, Juanjuan, thank you so much for the wonderful talk, and thanks to all of you for joining us here today. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.